Well, thank you very much, everybody, and congratulations on getting off to such an early start. I'm going to talk about the relationship between energy and money and the mess that we've got ourselves into internationally at present, and how we might get out of that mess. And there's always been a very close link between energy and money. When gold was used as money, it was primarily an energy currency, because if energy became cheaper, more abundant, then it became profitable to set your slaves, if that was the form of the energy that you had, or your horses, or your steam coal, to mine gold and put it into circulation, and that increased the amount of trade that was possible, and consequently the demand for labor or other sources of energy. But of course, that link, which worked very well for hundreds of years, the only time that the gold standard broke down seriously was when the Spanish raided South America and stole gold from the Aztecs and the Incas and took it back to Spain. And that essentially destroyed the Spanish economy, because they were able to buy in goods from elsewhere in Europe. And they neglected their own crafts. And there was, in fact, an early example of what's known today as the curse of oil. That those countries that have abundance of oil and get money in too easily do badly. You just have to think of countries like Nigeria in this context. So the gold standard worked pretty well, and of course it hung on in one form or another until President Nixon abandoned the link between the dollar and gold in 1972. And since then, there's been no formal link between our money and anything real. And this has meant that the central bankers have just kept a close eye on the price level. And if prices are only inching up, then they reckon that there's about the right amount of money in circulation. So there's always been this link. But now that we've passed the peak of conventional oil, we're going down the other side, that oil production is only being maintained on the plateau that it's on at the moment by the use of unconventional sources of oil, which take more energy to produce. Now there's that limit. It matters very much where the energy comes from, who is producing it, because energy is going back to be money again. If you have a source of energy under your control, then quite literally you have the power to determine what's done. So it matters very much. Now, if a country is taking its energy from outside, it's lost its sovereignty in a real sense. But the same thing applies to communities. If a community is dependent on getting its energy in from outside, then it's always going to be a price taker. It's always going to be competing with other communities around the world for a diminishing supply of oil. So we need to recognize money and energy as being very, very closely linked. And We'll take the first slide. This shows the relationship between the number of seconds of work required to buy a kilowatt hour of electricity between 1920 and getting on for the present day. And you can see that what happened was that in terms of the length of time people had to work for it, energy became much cheaper. In other words, it became much cheaper in real terms. Now, what happens if energy becomes cheaper? Well, we use more of it, and we used more for everything. We incorporated it into all of our production processes. We became superhumans in a sense, because with the slaves, essentially, that this energy represents, this cheap energy represents, we were able to produce far more. And an age of relative abundance, relative to everything that had gone before in history, came about. Next slide, please. This shows what happened over that same period. These figures are food prices in the United States. So just as energy fell in price in terms of minutes worth of time, so food prices fell in terms of the minutes worth of time that you had to work to earn a £3 chicken. And of course, energy had a lot to do with bringing down that price, because the chickens were being fed with grain that was being produced using a lot of energy in the production process. And of course, it also meant that the scale had to increase, because if you were a farmer and growing chickens, and the price of the chickens that you were producing fell to 90% of their value, and you were getting, let's say, 10% of the price of your profit, you had to increase your scale greatly in order to be able to maintain your income at the previous level. But if you wished to keep your income in step with everybody else in society, the scale on which you had to farm chickens grew and grew. So two major elements of the cost of living fell drastically during the period between 1920 and 1980. And it was this that enabled the consumer society to be born, because there was a surplus now. We didn't need to work all day to get food on the table and to have a warm house at night. So in the richer countries of the world, there was discretionary income to spend for the first time. So let's take the next slide. This is something that you probably heard about yesterday from Dr. Tainter. This comes direct from him, that you can measure complexity by the number of artifacts in common use and the number of recognized job descriptions. And the thing that he teaches is the close link between energy use and complexity. So increasing complexity. Let's go to the next slide. Here you have a shop in a village in India, and you can get an idea of the level of energy use and the complexity of that society by getting some sort of idea of the number of lines that shop might take. And it's interesting that the bananas and the other produce there would be locally sourced, and the soft drinks would come in from the nearest city. There's very little. I mean, there's some energy use there in producing it, but contrast it with the next slide. Have you moved on? You should be looking now at a shot of a typical supermarket. Now, a supermarket could have 15,000 lines, and to get that level of choice, of complexity assembled, you have to be producing, and at a price that people can afford, you have to be producing on a large scale in order to get the economies of scale. And this means that you need to be bringing the goods that you're selling in from a wide area. So this is a very energy intensive form of consumption. And of course, the big question, and I've no doubt that David Korovich was asking this yesterday, is how much of this complex system, energy intensive system, can be maintained as we go down the other side, the other side of the energy availability curve. Next slide, please. Here's another example of complexity. This is a catalogue that put out by a store chain that supplies goods in Britain and Ireland. It has tens of thousands of goods in it, and they can only be produced at a price that consumers can afford on quite a large scale. And of course, choice has, in many cases, got out of hand. I looked recently at the number of data projectors that are available, and there are 250 that are readily available on the Irish market. Why do we need such a massive choice? There has been this explosion of choice, and this has been the product of an abundance of energy. But as we all know, this is about to change. Let's go to the next slide. You'll all have seen slides like this before, that oil is expected to reach a peak, that we're somewhere close to that peak now, and then there's going to be a contraction in certainly the availability of oil as we go down the other side. It's not an up-to-date graph. It's got WEO 2006 on it. Well, that stands for the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook 2006, and that's their projection of, if you have a business as usual world, the level of oil production that's going to be needed to maintain that. But the new World Energy Outlook, published for 2010, is quite a different and quite a desperate document. They're getting very worried indeed that the oil is just not going to be there. Let's go on to the next slide. Why isn't the energy, and specifically the oil, going to be there? It's because the oil that is being found these days is taking a lot of energy to produce. So this slide comes from Charles Hall, and it plots the amount of energy that is being required to find oil and to develop oil fields in comparison with the amount of oil that is being found. So that's the energy return on the energy invested. That's what the EROI stands for on the y-axis. And so you can see that there's been a fall, and all three authorities agree. And so now the return that you can get from investing energy in finding oil is of the order of 20 times. That's the return. But in the 1930s, the return was 100 times. And if you, as Charles Hall has done there, project the trend into the future by something like 2017, the return on the energy you get will more or less exactly equal the amount of energy you're finding. And so naturally you will stop. In fact, you'll stop before then. I mean, you might think that you would go on exploiting oil for as long as you got just a little bit more energy back from your efforts in looking for it and developing oil fields. But that's not the case at all, because consider the effects that that would have on your society. It means that essentially all your effort goes into providing your society with energy, that there is no energy left for anything else. So we need to think, how much energy do we need to run after we've produced that energy? How much do we need to have left over to be able to run a relatively complex society? Next slide, please. This is another Charles Hall graph, and if you look at the blue circle right at the top, that says domestic oil in 1930. So it shows the 100 to 1 return. You're getting 100 times more oil, more energy than you put into finding it. Then that line moves down to the purple circle with D oil 1970 in it. That's domestic oil production. At that time, it was giving something maybe under 40 return. And then D oil today, the red circle, it's giving something under 20. And new oil, he's putting there at maybe around 10 or 12. And then you see the line he's got there saying minimum required. Now that's the minimum required to run a relatively complex society. Now you can do similar charts for other sources of energy. And you can see that he's got hydro on it there. And so hydro is giving something like a 60 to 1 return. But of course, the prospects of hydro are limited. It's not everywhere that you can produce that. It's interesting to see where he puts nuclear. That's that white circle, oval, at about 15 to 1 return. So what we need to be looking for is technologies, replacement technologies for fossil fuels that give a high energy return on the energy invested in them, and also give us quite a quick return, because we need to be able to get that energy back quite quickly. So Tom Conrad has produced the concept of the energy internal rate of return. And on that, because it takes so long to build a nuclear station, it takes a long time before you can get the energy back from that and invest it in something else. Nuclear doesn't score at all. Wind scores very well. It gives a high energy return on energy invested, and you get it back quickly, so that you can use the energy that you're getting back to put in more wind turbines. So these are the sorts of calculations that we previously made for money. Investors use the internal rate of return in assessing different projects. We need to be thinking now in terms of an energy internal rate of return. Next slide, please. Now, if we have a declining energy return on energy invested, you're obviously getting less and less of the energy that's available. The total amount of energy there that's available for use, and it falls off a cliff. So you can see what happens there. There's not much change. We're not really looking at a big change between an energy return on energy invested of say 20 to 1 and 100 to 1. Sure, we're getting less, but we're still getting 19 units of energy for every one that we invest. But supposing it goes to half that, at that stage, 10% of the energy that we're exploiting gets taken up by the energy production process, and then down to 5 to 1, 20% goes. And so you can see it's like falling off a cliff, following that curve there. So the dark area there is the energy that is lost because it's required for the production process, and the lighter grey area is the energy that is we actually get to use. So this sort of thing creeps up on us, and proposals for, let's say, sequestering emissions from coal-burning power plants, that takes both energy to sequester them, to pump them down a disused oil well, but it also takes a lot of energy actually to compress the CO2 and put it down. And this does an enormous damage to the energy return on energy invested, so much so that I don't think that technique will in fact ever be used. Let's go on to the next slide. So I said earlier that the world oil supply is on a plateau at the moment, and this is what we've got. So this takes it up to June this year from December 2001, and so you can see that until 2005 there was an increase in the oil supply, and then it's been pretty well flat ever since. Now, the dark oil at the bottom is conventional oil. It's giving you a good energy return on energy invested. The net energy, if you're reading the words on the chart there, the net energy return you're getting is the highest, and on the top, the lighter blue, that's unconventional oil. You can see that that's increased as a proportion, at least of the total amount of oil, and the energy return on that isn't nearly as good. Next slide, please. Now, all this affects the price. I said right at the beginning that the price of energy had fallen between 1920 and 1980, and had been on a plateau more or less since. But energy is extraordinarily valuable in increasing our productivity. So you and I would be doing very well to produce 3 kilowatt hours of energy in the course of a 40-hour working week. What's that worth? How much are you paying for a kilowatt hour? In Ireland, we're paying about 15 euro cents per kilowatt hour. If I can use that kilowatt hour to boost my productivity, to do something like working a chainsaw, that can make me enormously more productive than somebody who doesn't have access to this, a convenient, cheap form of energy like that. Next slide, please. A litre of petrol. How much I know you use gallons in the US, but I've no doubt you also know the conversion figure. No, a litre of petrol, for which we would pay about 1 euro 25 in Ireland, and there's a lot of tax in that, has the energy equivalent to 3 weeks manual work. So what this means is that if we can use energy productively, the price that we are prepared to pay for it in money terms can go very, very high indeed. You will lose some of the uses that we're getting very little benefit from, but the real premium uses, like using it to boost productivity, to do things like working a digger. I mean, if you have some sort of excavator, how much more productive does that make the people involved? That sort of use is going to mean that the price of energy gets very, very high indeed. Next, please. So this rather old slide takes us through what's been happening to the price of oil to about 2007. And then I've got a slide that follows that picks it up from there. And so you can see that for a long period, the price of oil was very low and constant. And then there was the two actions by OPEC, one in 1973 at the time of the Yom Kippur War, which doubled the price of oil. And then there was a second one in 1979, 1980, which pushed it up again. And they did this by restricting supply. But then it fell back from that, and it was heading back in inflation-adjusted returns to not too far from what it had been from the 1940s to the 1970s. But then we began to run into resource constraints. And on this chart, it goes up to $102 a barrel. Let's go to the next one, which picks up the story. And you can see it picks it up at just below 100 and takes it up to $145 a barrel in the early part of 2008. And then it crashed. And I'm going to explain why it crashed in a minute and what we can do about it. And it dropped to about $40 a barrel it's picked up since then, and it's hovering at about $80 a barrel at the moment. And I want you to look at the red line, because that red dotted line is the price of non-energy commodities, because they are getting scarce too, and they're needing more and more energy to produce them. And so they rose with the price of energy, they dropped with the price of oil, and then they begin picking up. But the oil price has been fairly flat for the last year. Commodity prices have been going sort of up and up. And so we're getting a polarized world. And the polarity that's developing is between the oil and commodity consumers and oil and commodity producers. And this is very significant because it's changing the balance of power in the world. Next slide, please. Now, again, I expect a lot of you have seen slides like this one, and that whenever the US spends more than a certain percentage of its national income on crude oil, it sort of knocks the guts out of the economy. And the critical level seems to be, you can afford to spend about 3%, but once it goes above 3%, then too much money is taken out of people's hands, which they would have used for consumption. So they have to heat their houses, they're running their cars, the whole food processing system has to continue to operate. So there is less discretionary money available for them to maintain the level of economic activity in the economy. And so you get the grey areas that I showed there, that recessions set in. And so you can see how the oil price, look at the far right of the chart, you can see how it rose and became a bigger and bigger proportion of national income. It peaked at over 6%, and then it dropped back as oil prices fell. But it wasn't just oil; it was the other commodities too. And to the extent that the US was importing these commodities from elsewhere, that was money that was leaving the US, and it was going to the producer economies.